A gute Woche, a freilichen Shushan-Form. We are in the middle of 30 letters in 30 days, and, we can't miss, even though Shabbos just ended. But it's important consistency. The only day that we miss is Friday, but we don't really miss it because we double up with a little Lechem Mishnah on Leil Shishi. We do a double letter Thursday night. Got a lot of comments about the double letter Thursday night to David Lesselbaum, Alav Shalom, about his miraculous interactions with the politician Rebbe Yaakov Zerubbabel. That was, to me, that's just a wild story. If you missed that because it was Thursday night and you were preparing for Shabbos, or you were, you got home late from Kriyas and Megillah, go back and listen to the previous shir. Just in general, if you are watching these classes on YouTube, here's something very convenient you can do for yourself. Just make sure to subscribe to my channel, so SoulWords, and turn on notifications. And then every time we go live with another shir, you're going to be notified. It'll just make life so much easier. You're busy, Just subscribe and do it right now. If you're watching on YouTube, just subscribe and hit turn on notifications. If you're watching on soulwords.org on the website, I don't have any notifications or subscription like that. But if you're listening on podcast platforms, you can subscribe to the podcast. Okay. Without further ado, tonight's letter. Tonight's letter is a little bit of a departure. It is not from the Igros Kodesh. We normally learn a letter from the Igros. And the Igros are all Hebrew and Yiddish. Tonight's letter is English, and to my knowledge, it is not printed anywhere. It is a genuine Pirsum Rishon, meaning this is the first time that it's being shared on a large scale. And I received this letter from a friend, Rabbi Yaakov Cohn of Potomac, Maryland, and Boca Raton, Florida. A personal friend, a friend of SoulWords. And he called me up and he said he has this really special letter. How did he get it? He actually knew the people involved. And it's a tragic story. This happened in 1972, where a family from, the address on the letter says Silver Spring, Maryland, but a family in Maryland suffered a terrible, unthinkable loss, a tragic loss. Their daughter was murdered. And the mother was understandably inconsolable, and she reached out everywhere for comfort, and she didn't really find any type of solace. And somebody told her, she was not a Lubavitcher at all, somebody told her to write to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which she did, and she received this response. So we're going to read and learn the Rebbe's response to this grieving mother. Rabbi Yaakov received, I think, the photocopy or facsimile from the brother of the woman whose life was taken. I think that's how he got a hold of it. And then he sent me the facsimile. I will put it up on the screen so you can see what it looks like. As far as the PDF that you can download, that's we laid it out just to make it consistent with the format of the other PDFs and to make it easier to read, but I will put the original facsimile on the screen so you can just get a taste of the authentic look. I actually have it printed out right here, and that's what I'm going to read from the facsimile. Okay. By the grace of God, 20th of Kislev, 5732 Brooklyn, New York, right? It's 1972, or it's could be the last months of 1971. Probably it's not yet 1972. Mrs. Ethel Rosen, 10513 Calumet Drive, Silver Spring, Maryland, 20901. Blessing and greeting. I'm in receipt of your letter in which you write about the tragedy in the family. Okay, I said already what that tragedy was. Her daughter was murdered. Needless to say, I have heard and been informed about it. That is very interesting, by the way, just that the Rebbe says needless to say. Not only that the Rebbe says, I already was informed about it, but needless to say. Like, I don't even have to tell you, but I'm just letting you know, I guess, in case it provides you any comfort or whatever the case may be. But the Rebbe is saying it's like it's an obvious thing that I already know about it, which is interesting to me. Okay. It is, of course, difficult to alleviate the shock of such a tragedy by mere words. Right? So basically, the Rebbe is already saying that, there's a certain shock of the tragedy. I think nowadays people, 2025, people will talk about trauma, right? That the body keeps the score, right? There's certain things that you can't just talk your way out of. It's not in the brain. You can't just reframe it with your brain. Your body is actually in shock. So, pretty much what the Rebbe is saying here is that with mere words, words aren't going to take away the shock. Like there's a certain, because it wasn't just the loss of a loved one. It was in a violent way, in a shocking, violent, horrific way. So the words don't take away the shock. Okay. However, I wish to emphasize one basic point, which must always be remembered, namely, that God is the creator and master of the world at large, and of each and every individual in particular. Although God's ways are inscrutable, meaning we can't really understand God's ways, we must nevertheless firmly believe that there is a purpose in everything, and also some hidden good, however difficult it is to see or understand. Okay, so again, this is not to take away the shock, but it is a perspective that when you're ready to start to try to view this in any particular way, one has to take into account this idea of hashgacha pratis, basically, is what the Rebbe is saying. Okay, so that's the first point that Rebbe points out, that somehow there is some type of sense to the senselessness, even if it's not something that the human mind can ever wrap itself around. A further basic and most important point to remember is that the soul is eternal, and that it has an existence independent of the body which it inhabits only for a brief period of its sojourn on this earth. There's some type of a correction here. I don't know if it's the Rebbe's own pen mark, but it looks like perhaps the word a is removed. And, maybe it says the on top of a, which would make sense, which it inhabits only for the brief period of its sojourn on earth. That makes more sense. That the soul is in a body, how long? Because it exists independently of the body, but it exists in the body for the brief, that makes more sense, the brief period of its sojourn on this earth. Or like they say, we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. That's an important concept, that the soul did not begin its existence with embodiment, and it does not end its existence with the end of embodiment. It is therefore not only a matter of religious faith, but also of common sense. I love that juxtaposition. It's not just a matter of faith, of religious faith, but also of common sense, that the life of the soul cannot be affected by any physical interference, nor can it be interrupted by a bullet and the like. Okay, that I was being very specific about the nature of the incident. An act of physical violence can only affect the soul's connection with the body, but not the soul itself. When I read this, I was struck by the similarity with a letter that's in the Igros, a Hebrew letter in the Igros. It was written actually to a well-known person, to Ariel Sharon, who was a general at the time. It was about a year after the Six-Day War, which is where he sort of became a well-known public figure. The letter to Sharon is in the Igros in volume 25 in Chof Hey, and it's letter Tes Shin Pei Aleph, meaning 9,381 from Yud Gimel Tishrei Tavshin Chof Ches. So you're talking about the Six-Day War was in Sivan of Chav Zayin. So this is 3-4 months later. Meaning at the beginning of the new year, after that summer, Ariel Sharon's son died in an accident at home, and the Rebbe wrote him consolations. And it's a very interesting letter because there the Rebbe unpacks the Hamokim Yenachem, traditional words of comfort that we say. And first of all, the Rebbe begins the letter by telling Sharon that it was very heartening to see the publicized pictures of you putting on tefillin at the Kaisel. Remember, this was 1967 is when Jewish people were able again to access the Kaisel Hamarovi, the Western Wall. So the Rebbe says it was very heartening to see a picture of you wearing tefillin in front of the Western Wall. And then the Rebbe mentions the idea of Hamokim Yenachem Eschem B'Seich Sharavei Tzion V'Yerushalayim, which is the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, which means over the destruction of the temple, and sort of juxtaposed with the fact that Sharon was photographed in front of the ruins of the temple, which sometimes we forget. The Western Wall is a ruin. It's a remnant of a destroyed building. Al pi halacha, one has to tear kriyo, has to rend one's garments when one sees the Makam Mikdash, the site of the Holy Temple, in such a state. Whether you do or you don't, you have to ask your local Orthodox rabbi, but the point is it's a site of destruction. So in that letter to Sharon, the Rebbe writes, it's interesting that we mention Avei Tzion V'Yerushalayim in comforting an individual about an individual loss. So the Rebbe says one thing to learn from that is there is no individual loss, that we as a Jewish people are united. We're one entity, one organism, and there's no such thing as a private loss of one family. It's all, just like we all mourn the destruction of the temple, we all mourn the loss that an individual family suffers, God forbid. The other thing is, the Rebbe says 3 points. Second point is that just as we know that Mashiach will come and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, so too we know there will be Tchias HaMesim, we'll be reunited. We will be reunited with our loved ones who have passed on. And the third thing is, and this is why I'm thinking about it here in conjunction with this letter, the third point is that although the Babylonians and later the Romans were given permission to destroy the physical structure of the temple, that does not do anything to the spiritual power of that place, the sanctity, the holiness of that place. So it is only the physical structure that they had power over and were able to destroy, but not the spiritual energy of the place. So similarly, the Rebbe is saying here that the act of violence, an act of physical violence, can only affect the soul's connection with the body, but not the soul itself, right? The body can be murdered and can have its life cut short. That the soul cannot be murdered. The soul not only cannot be murdered, the soul cannot be even affected. It just continues to be what it is, and it's not assailable. It is not vulnerable to any act in this physical world. It remains, which is such an important idea. Okay, it is also clear, continuing here, next paragraph, it is also clear that the attachment and love of parents for their children are not based on the physical aspects of the body, but rather on the spiritual aspects of personality, character, qualities, etc. Such an important point. You could make a whole parenting class just on that one sentence. The connection between parents and their children is not a physical connection. It's not that your relationship with that person is based on their physical qualities. Oh, you're so tall, you're so handsome, right? You're so good at basketball. It's not based on physical qualities. The connection is based on spiritual qualities. And the Rebbe doesn't say this, so I want to be clear. I'm not like saying this is the meaning, but what hit me is a concept that the Rebbe said many, many times in the name of the Alter Rebbe, which the Alter Rebbe writes in the Geras HaKodesh, that the life of a tzaddik is not physical life, but it's rather his Avos Hashem and Yiras Hashem and Amunas Hashem, so that the physical passing of a tzaddik doesn't affect the main qualities of the tzaddik, which are spiritual qualities, and therefore they remain in full force. And if anything, they're even stronger because they're no longer contained by bodily limitations. So Rebbe doesn't say that here, but in my mind, it was such an interesting parallel that what's the connection of the Talmidim to the tzaddik? It's a spiritual connection. So the cessation of the tzaddik's physical life doesn't interrupt that. And if anything, it can even facilitate a greater connection. So possibly similarly, the Rebbe is saying that the connection of parents to their children is not a physical thing. It's not based on the child's physical qualities, but their spiritual qualities. In other words, all the things which are lasting and are not terminated by the soul's departure from the body. There is this difference, however. Okay, now, having said that, there is a difference. We're not going to pretend that nothing changed. There is something that changed. The Rebbe is going to acknowledge it right here. That the soul of a Jew always wants to do good. And so long as it is connected with the body in this life, it can do good for itself. Meaning, on its own. It wants to do good. Doing good means doing mitzvahs. And as long as it has a body, the soul can, if it wants to do a mitzvah, it can do a mitzvah. But after departing from this world and rising to the higher world, the world of truth, where its desire is to do all that is good and holy, is even greater. See, ironically, now the soul's out of a body. It wants to do good even more than it wanted to do before. But not being any more encumbered by a physical body, it can no longer do good deeds in this world for itself. So it has an increased appetite for doing good, but it can't do it anymore. When it had a body, all it has to do is want to do a mitzvah, so go do a mitzvah. Who's stopping you? When it doesn't have a body, it wants to do a mitzvah, but it has no body. How's it supposed to do a mitzvah? So therefore what happens? But must depend upon those near and dear ones left behind, especially parents, to do all the mitzvahs and tzedakah, etc., which it would have done. In other words, in addition to all the good that the parents and relatives of the departed soul do in fulfillment of their own obligations, they now have the obligations and schos, both obligations and schos, meaning it's an obligation, it's a duty, but it's also a schos, it's a privilege, to do a little, quotes around little, a little more, on account and in behalf and for the schos of the dear departed soul. So something did change. What changed is that the soul can no longer do what it wants to do, which is to do good here in this world. But that's where you come in. And you are going to act as the arms and legs of that soul and do the things that it wants to do. The soul, which is now in the higher world, derives great satisfaction from what is done for it in terms of Torah and mitzvahs, and is very grateful for it, though it cannot directly convey this gratitude. When I read this line, I was also reminded of a story. I think it's in To Know and to Care. A story about a chassid from Yerushalayim who was waiting for Yechidus, and he saw someone in front of him, a rich man who looked very, very agitated, go into Yechidus. And when this rich man came out of Yechidus, he looked like his load had been lightened. He looked like he was relieved. And so the chassid asked he asked Maskiros, actually, who is this guy? They said he's this wealthy guy. He lost his only son. So he asked, if you don't mind, he asked the guy, if you don't mind, like, I see that you came out from Yechidus looking so, like, relieved. What happened? So he said, the Rebbe asked me, if your son went to a foreign country and you could not communicate with him and he could not communicate with you, but you knew he was well taken care of, and that he was in the best condition that he could be in, would you accept that? And the guy says, yeah, I guess if I had to accept it, I would accept it. He says, so the Rebbe says, and what if I were to tell you that you could even send him gifts and he would appreciate those gifts? Would you send him gifts? Would you accept that? He said, yes, I would. I would send him gifts. And the Rebbe said, every mitzvah you do on his behalf, all the Torah you learn on his behalf, every word of prayer that you say on his behalf, those are the gifts, and he appreciates them. You can't communicate, but you can send him gifts. So I thought that was reminiscent of this. Okay. I mean, especially with the next line. But the important thing is not to receive words of thanks in this case, right? Because no communication. So you're not going to hear words of thanks for the mitzvahs you do on behalf of the departed soul, but to know that one is doing the right thing. Yeah, it's tough because you're not going to get your certified answer. Yes, we've received your mitzvah on high. It has been counted in the merit of this neshama. You're not going to get that, but you have to know that that is indeed the case. Much more could be said on this subject, but I trust that the above will suffice. I merely will summarize. You and your husband, because this was written to the mother, but it's apparently also for the husband. You and your husband should be permeated with the idea of the eternity of the soul, right? That the cessation of physical embodiment does not change the soul. And permeated also, I love this word permeated, like not just to know it, but to really absorb, be fully conscious, mindful of this idea. And permeated also with the idea that in addition to your own good deeds, right, you got to still do your own good deeds. Put your oxygen masks on first, right? You now have to do a little more. The Rebbe says little. This is the second time the Rebbe says little. Like, I guess not to make it intimidating. Like, just a little more. To do a little more in behalf of the soul of your dear departed daughter. And that if you should do this with devotion and inspiration, in the full knowledge that it is a great schus for your departed daughter, peace to her soul. It's important that Rebbe is saying here that you should know what is happening when you're doing this little more, that this is a benefit for her. Right, so the soul is eternal. The soul continues. The main relationship and connection between parents and children is a spiritual connection. That hasn't changed. And you can do things for her, which she will deeply appreciate. May God grant that henceforth you should have only good news to report, the kind of good news that is revealed and obvious. Because at the beginning of the letter, the Rebbe said that there's hidden good in everything. But the Rebbe is concluding the letter by saying you shouldn't have the type of good that you have to go searching for. You have to figure out how maybe it's good, or you have to use your emunah to believe that it's good, even though you can never see the goodness. No. You should have the good that's easy to identify as good. With blessing, the Rebbe's holy signature in English. P.S. Although the letter has been written to you, in reply to your letter, it is, of course, intended also for all those with whom you may wish to share it and to whom it may hopefully be of benefit. I'm sorry if I'm getting slightly emotional, but I've personally seen, you guys don't know all the stories that I know. Every time we do one of these classes, I get communications from people, calls, texts, emails about ways in which these letters are just relevant in such an uncanny way, where they really feel that there's a real communication going on here. And now when you explicitly have the P.S. that the Rebbe is saying to the recipient of the letter, that this is not just for you, it's for anyone you want to share the letter with. And of course, we know that the mother shared this letter with my friend Rabbi Yaakov, who shared it with me to share with you. So am I taking liberties to say that the Rebbe is writing here explicitly in this letter that this letter is for us? It's for anybody that the original recipient wanted to share it with, and by a chain of one person knowing another person, and now it's being shared with you. And if Bashgacha Pratis, you're hearing this right now, I guess this is for you. Okay. A good Tvach, and we'll see you tomorrow night for another letter.